We'll call the meeting to order at 5:30. First item on the agenda is public comment for anybody that might have anything to comment on that's not on the agenda today. And I don't see anybody in the audience. Do we have anybody online? Okay. Well, item is the action items. First up is the sage grouse with Nicole. If you could give us an update.
Good evening, commissioners. For the record, Nicole Mardell, Senior Planner with Deschutes County Community Development. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint loaded up here. Okay. So tonight it's a kind of an informational update for you on a process that's been going on at the state level for the past couple years. So just a bit of background. I'm sure many of you hopefully have seen sage grouse before, but if not, I don't know if you can see my PowerPoint, but I have some very cute photos of them for you this evening. So just a bit of background. So in 2010, the state started the process to look at sage grouse as a candidate species for the Endangered Species Act. So it was essentially identified as a candidate by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. There was some conversation with property owners and some different groups around the state. And in order to avoid that listing, which some Eastern Oregon counties were concerned would have a negative impact on the economy in Eastern Oregon, there was a decision instead to move forward with a conservation assessment and strategy and adoption of some habitat maps from Oregon Fish and Wildlife. Those maps were adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission in OAR 660-23-0115. That's the Goal 5 section of the OAR. So through that process, the Land Conservation and Development Commission essentially adopted regulations that would protect sage grouse habitat by regulating what are called large-scale development uses. So those are things that are over 50 feet in height, have a direct impact in excess of 5 acres, generate more than 50 vehicle trips per day, or create noise levels of at least 70 decibels for a sustained period. So these are mostly things like commercial uses, oil and gas, transportation, utility facilities, parks, kind of your larger scale uses. Agricultural uses were exempt, and things that don't require land use approval were also exempt. But those rules were put in place to greater preserve sage grouse habitat to avoid depreciation of that species. It established 3 habitat areas. So core habitat, that's nearest to the lek, the strutting grounds. So that's kind of the most important for sage grouse. Low density, which is kind of their migration area around that lek, and then general habitat. The DLCD, through this rule, required 7 Eastern Oregon counties to implement it. So it wasn't optional, it was mandatory. Many jurisdictions in the state decided to just apply rule directly. We at Deschutes County decided to establish a greater sage grouse combining zone for ease of use for county property owners. So we have a more detailed map that shows parcel by parcel where you are in that designation, so it's a little bit easier to read, although that was optional for us to adopt that local combining zone. Wanted to note that it applies primarily to Eastern Deschutes County, so it was in the packet, but I also printed out a map. So this is area that's already typically zoned EFU, the Horse Ridge subzone, which has quite large minimum parcel sizes. And there's also quite a bit of federal land in this area, although of course that's not under our jurisdiction. They have their own sage grouse protections that the BLM adopts. Wanted to note that there was kind of in the OAR, there was a goal to revisit these habitat maps in about 10 years to make sure that they still were, effective in preserving this habitat and to make sure that these lek areas hadn't changed. So ODF&W began that process to collect collaring data and to revisit kind of their modeling for these habitat areas around 2020-ish. And then in March 2022, they initiated their formal update to update these habitat maps. They released them in July, and Deschutes County was a close partner of theirs, so we reviewed these maps when they originally came out. and, kind of provided our thoughts on some of the kind of initial items that they had identified. But ODF&W made it very clear to us as planners that any map amendment needed to be justified by biological data. So you couldn't say, I don't see any sage grouse around my house. This is mapped incorrectly. You would have to provide essentially a biological study proving that it's incorrect mapping. So they had an open house in Bend in August of 2023. We attended that. There are only a few people there. But again, they kind of noted that it would be pretty difficult to offer any comments on these maps since they are based on scientific biological data. And in December 2023, they moved forward to officially adopt those maps. So the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission adopted those maps. Once they were adopted, DLCD began kind of preparation for their update to incorporate this into the OAR. There was a bit of delay just because they had quite a few other items that they were working on. So we got a notice this year in October that they were planning to adopt the new map in January. And today, LCDC actually held their hearing, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So through that process, DLCD had us send on their behalf a Measure 56 notice. Of course, they reimbursed us in case you're curious. But they sent that notice to property owners because there were some slight changes. And I'll go into that kind of in the next slide here. So as you can see on the map that's in front of you, the area that's outlined in the darker green with that kind of dark green boundary and then the brown, kind of that dark brown boundary, that's the new area. So you can see that in Deschutes County, there's actually a slight reduction. In talking with ODF&W staff, there was a reduction to that general habitat area. We actually don't see that in Deschutes County anymore, or really anywhere statewide, because they were able to get collaring data that was quite a bit more specific. So they were able to identify more exactly where those core and low density habitats are. For us, the boundaries slightly shifted. So you can see that some of the previous low density habitat area is now core, but otherwise it's pretty similar to what it was in 2015. Overall, we're seeing about 27,353 acres, a reduction in that amount. But we are seeing some properties kind of being swapped into the boundary. About 180 are being swapped in, 180 are being swapped out, and about 70 or so tax lots are being remapped from low density to core, and about 32 are going the other way from core to low density. Wanted to also note that our unincorporated communities, so Milliken, Brothers, and Hampton, those are those little carve-outs that you see in there. They were essentially carved out by ODF&W because of those pre-existing levels of development and because they have those special permissions in the OAR to allow things like commercial uses. So you might have noticed those carve-outs there. Wanted to note that, of course, this is different from other Goal 5 inventories. So unlike, for instance, our landscape management combining zone or a mule deer inventory, we cannot opt out or alter these regulations. This is direct from the state. So we are required to, implement following adoption. Today, LCDC did have their public hearing. They voted to approve the map change in the OAR, so that's all complete. Because of the mandatory nature of this proposal, we decided it would be more streamlined to have a work session with you so that you're up to speed on this topic. But we are skipping a hearing at the Planning Commission level and moving forward to a Board of County Commissioners hearing on February 5th. So at that time, we plan to hold the public hearing and potentially have deliberations and adopt these updated maps at that time. With that, I welcome any questions.
Yeah. Commissioner Kelsey?
Excuse me. I was curious. I tend to recreate west of town and not east of town. So my experience is west, and I have seen grouse west of town. And I'm curious, is that area part of the study, or is that area mapped, or how is that affected in this study?
That's an interesting question. Peter's our resident sage grouse expert. I think from, really what the data that we received from ODF&W, what you're seeing here is where they identified the leks that required protection. So this is the information that we received for the total of Deschutes County, the area where they see LECs that, are active.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure, Peter, if you had heard in the past of any Western,
Yeah, probably the short answer is you weren't on the map, but you will be now.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and planning commissioners. To Commissioner Kelly's question, while you may have been seeing a certain type of grouse, it wasn't necessarily a sage grouse, which are
Oh.
predominant in certain portions of central and eastern Oregon. And this process that Nicole has now provided this extensive update, the state has been spent, for years, for well over a decade, the state has been doing everything they can to address sage grouse habitat and the circumstances that threaten it, which in Oregon, in many respects, it's not anthropogenic uses. There's a lot of fire, there's a lot of invasive vegetation that comes in and disrupts. You'll see this in the broader areas of eastern Oregon. I think that's the biggest threat, but the state's committed to try to keep the sage grouse as a candidate species under the Endangered Species Act, as opposed to having it elevate to a threatened status, because then you're, of course, subject to the Endangered Species Act. So as credit to Tim Berg, one of our systems analysts who produced the maps that you've seen, to be able to distinguish the area that has changed since it was first adopted. There are areas that have gone down. We haven't improved, probably have this in your report, but Deschutes County hasn't approved a large scale land use in our jurisdiction. Much of that is due to the restrictive statewide land use system as it pertains to exclusive farm use, but most of the land that's being put to productive use is farmland and farmland ranching, and they've got everyone's driven east to take advantage of what's beyond the other side. And we're fortunate in that the landscape, the use of the land is relatively compatible for the bird. And whereas when you get into more of our rural counties, there's big solar, there's significant transmission lines that have been proposed, and other uses that wind energy, for example, just the disturbance there on the ground. So we're relatively, we're obviously remain relatively intact in terms of the habitat that has been provided. There's a disturbance ratio that the state utilizes in the event that a county or a region in a priority area of conservation, which would be a core area, if there's a certain percentage that's disturbed, that initiates a response from the state. And thus far, we're doing as it pertains to the bird, we really haven't seen the disturbances. So it's a basin and range type of habitat. Commissioner Hovkamp is, with his expertise in biology, can get into more specifics, but that's how I would offer kind of the supplemental remarks that Nicole's just provided.
Any other questions?
Did anyone attend the public hearing today without DCD?
I watched the live stream.
Mhm.
There were some public comments. One of the items that didn't necessarily impact us, that was the major topic of discussion, was that Grant County previously wasn't listed as one of the counties that was required to follow this rule. And they actually had some mapped sage grouse territory. So there was a discussion over whether or not they should immediately be added, or if there should be some additional coordination with Grant County staff. So that was the majority of the discussion from folks who submitted comment. Because we sent the Measure 56 notice, I fielded about 10 phone calls, got a couple emails, and the majority of property owners that I talked to, their property actually didn't change in status. They were in low density and staying in low density, so not many concerns. We did get one letter of opposition, but I called that person and kind of let her know her designation wasn't changing, and she realized she didn't have really any concerns in that case. So that's what we've heard so far in the process.
Commissioner Kelly, you may have seen a forest grouse.
I had there were different grouses.
It'll be listed next. So,
Sure.
any other?
Or a grouse minor.
Yeah,
I
Commissioner?
feel the need to weigh in. It could have been a ruffed grouse or a blue grouse. I'm sure Commissioner Hopecamp is probably familiar with grouse too.
I'll make the.
Not that I know of, but they do beat.
I see and hear rough grouse in the forest west of here. I won't say all the time, but
Like, all the time. Yeah.
but they don't blow their chests.
Okay.
Yeah. When you're out in the woods and you hear that sound, that exactly what he just made that sound. Yeah. And, or if you're walking by and you hear, that's them.
Oh,
You're all
any,
right.
any other,
Those ones are not endangered.
any other questions for Nicole?
Get the opportunity to watch a video of a strut. Highly recommend. Very entertaining.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Next on the agenda, we have deliberations on our clear and objective housing text amendments, specifically on the discussion we had 2 weeks ago for our public hearing on mostly definitions.
Yeah, absolutely. For the record, Kyle Collins. So as the chair pointed out, we're here for deliberations following the public hearing on these clear and objective housing related code amendments. That public hearing took place exactly 2 weeks ago. Written record was left open for exactly a week. That ended last Thursday at the end of business. We only received one additional written comment during that period of time. It was from Commissioner Cyrus, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a second. Before I open it up to questions, I'll just kind of go through some of the discussion that we had in the hearing itself and provide a little bit of clarity there, some responses to Commissioner Cyrus's comments and some of the comments that came in both during the hearing and immediately preceding the hearing. And at that point, I'll try to answer any questions that you might have as you move through the deliberative process. So first thing that I want to talk about is a comment that came in from Central Oregon Land Watch. I mentioned this during the hearing. This came up immediately preceding the hearing, so it wasn't included in the presentation. But generally, they had some concerns that some included definition going to ultimately appear in our titles 18 and 19 might conflict with definitions that already exist in state law. So those OARs or ORS language. We concurred that was a reasonable concern. And so what we've done here, you can see this in the packet if you'd like to go to the individual page number, is that in each of those definition sections, we've just added a disclaimer essentially that says all the definitions herein are valid, but if there's some superseding state definition, then the state definition will overrule whatever our local definition is in case there is a conflict. Basically, we assume that was probably self-evident if we did actually have to go to like a hearing or something to clarify that, but just to make it abundantly clear, we wanted to state it up front. Any questions about that before I go to the next thing? Okay. Next big piece I wanted to discuss was a comment from Ms. Nunzi Gould that came up just regarding discussion of the amendments and a general assumption that it would be easier to look at these amendments as an entire package. As we pointed out during the hearing, this is probably the first of at least 3, probably closer to 4 or 5 different packages of amendments. And we've had to structure it that way just for to be honest, so you could digest this in a meaningful way. This is already a relatively big packet. I mean, it's hundreds of pages. Some of the changes are fairly minor. It's things like punctuation marks or word replacements based on new definitions. But even just with those relatively minor changes, it becomes kind of all encompassing and difficult to meaningfully wade through. So I just wanted to respond that that's typically the way we thought about this and the reason that we didn't move forward with a giant package of everything that we're going to propose over the next 5 months at this point moving forward. There were some more general discussions regarding words that weren't included in the Planning Commission's packet at the hearing that were subsequently included. We had a lot of discussion around the fact that this is sort of a work in progress, so to speak. So everything that you're looking at here, we add with the big caveat that as much as we can give you, we're trying to give you what we think is going to be the final product. But ultimately, everything really is a point in time snapshot. As new information comes forward, new concerns are raised by people in both our current planning department, people like our building safety division, things that we just don't deal with as long range planners on a day-to-day basis that are legitimate concerns that we need to address. And so as those things come up, we're obviously trying to incorporate those new comments. But for the most part, these things are tweaks around the edges rather than wholesale big bucket changes. Some of those things that came up were, for example, some tweaks to the definition of kitchen, the removal of housekeeping unit as a piece of language anywhere in the code. We essentially got away from that in terms of the dwelling unit definition specifically. That was where it was originally proposed. And then some additional questions regarding height and grade, which is now to move to Commissioner Cyrus's comment. His written comment specifically addressed what happens for, let's say, unique development considerations, like a daylight basement, for example. Potentially some very steep slope developments might have similar effects. Multi-sided residences or dwellings might start to throw off what we had originally proposed as how we're going to evaluate height. So to circle back around, the original proposal was height was essentially going to be measured from average grade. And average grade was going to be the lowest point adjacent to whatever your structure was, the highest point of whatever your structure was, the ground elevation of those 2 points, average them together, and then measure to the highest point of the dwelling. It's a relatively clean cut and straightforward way to evaluate that, but it does leave open the possibility that specific developments could be left out or exceed the height standards based on that. So it's a legitimate concern, and you'll see it in your packet here today. What we've tried to do is provide 2 separate avenues for determining height when moving forward. The first avenue, which we think is probably still the most clean cut, is what I've just described, that average grade, highest, lowest, highest point of the structure. The next is a bit more complicated, but it would likely allow for a more nuanced discussion of what height could be for some of these different types of developments. So what we've proposed is what you can describe as a perimeter sampling method. And essentially, it's the average of 8 measurements around the entire external perimeter of the structure. And all the measurement points have to be spaced equidistantly along the finished grade abutting the structure. So in practice, what we think this would be as proposed, and again, it's possible this language gets tweaked to get to what we're proposing here. But what it should be is that you would measure the entire external perimeter, you divide that by 8, you pick a starting point, and then you take 8 points that are all equidistant, and you take the average of whatever those numbers are. That gives you an average grade, and then again to the highest point of the structure. So hopefully between both of those 2 options, applicants can find a specific way of proposing plans and showing those to both planners and building safety division in a way that we can allow more developments that might have been restricted otherwise. Those are the big pieces that I want to discuss, changes that have kind of occurred in this newest iteration of the code that you've seen. Again, point in time. But for the most part, nothing else has changed from what you've seen during the public hearing process. Deliberations on this obviously could be pretty unwieldy. You've got a lot to talk about, but for the most part, you have a few different options. You can discuss this amongst yourselves. You can vote to approve the amendments or recommend approval of the amendments to the Board of County Commissioners. You can elect to discuss certain amendments if you'd like to tweak the language, either with specific language you would like to replace, or if you just want to discuss a general feature in a similar way that Commissioner Cyrus did with the height and grade discussion. And we can certainly propose that to the board moving forward at the next stage. You can approve certain amendments and deny certain other ones if you have strong feelings about those. You can recommend denial of the amendments altogether or any combination of all these. With that, I don't have any additional kind of staff comments at the front end, but if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer those.
Any questions before we get into deliberation?
I have just a couple comments that I
Certainly.
don't really have anything to do with deliberate. One is about discrete, which came up. Discrete, it should be discrete, DISCRETE as a defined space versus discrete, DISCREET, which is like secret, don't tell secrets kind of thing. Sorry. And then the other was there, the packet summary refers to removing the housekeeping unit. In the language, housekeeping unit is used on page 67. Need to go back to page 67. 67.
Correct. And
So I just didn't know if was like a leftover that was still there by mistake, or I didn't understand the earlier comments.
it's just a leftover
Okay.
there by mistakes. That particular definition and kind of the working draft that I have in preparations for the next stages of this, I've actually removed that
Okay.
and essentially just clarified that for the definition Commissioner Altman's referring to is the single family dwelling unit, 0 lot line, and it's a very specific kind of holdover definition that is unique to the Lapine neighborhood area. Deschutes County has a very small bit of jurisdiction over a very small area of South County. So we're required to keep this kind of weird one-off definition. But essentially moving forward, that would just be updated to clarify that it's a single unit dwelling, because that's the new language that we're proposing moving forward. Housekeeping unit would be removed entirely.
Okay. It's also on page 626, letter I,
Same.
under dwelling seasonal.
Yep.
That's it. Those are my only comments.
Great, thank you.
you.
Any others?
I guess I've got one.
Commissioner Hopkamp?
It's related to what I asked before. And you answered it pretty fully last time, but I want to ask it again. There are some in the definition section. There's a number of them. I'm sure I haven't caught them all. There's a number of them that simply say as set forth in ORS. Bam, that's it. Just reference ORS. And then there's others, apparently new language in here that kudos to staff. You know, you've gone to some work there in defining that length. Dwelling unit comes to mind, and a number of others. So, but not being as familiar as you with the ORS and so forth, seems to me that some of those that we've defined at length and specifically like dwelling unit might also be subject to changes at the state level or ORS that would supersede our definitions. Thus, you've put in that disclaimer, as you just highlighted a little bit right up front. I'm just unsure still why we have. I'm trying to think about from the user perspective, if they want to see in county code definition of lot or property line or some of those that would be sort of high use terminology, and they're like, oh hell, it's not there. I've got to go to the ORS. And I know I asked you this before, apologies, and I can understand that it would get unwieldy if we were to have all of those terms in there. What's the system where you decided to draw the line to refer to ORS and those that you spent some time defining?
That's a great question. And happy to answer.
Thank you.
Again.
Yeah.
In some sense, it's a case by case basis. The general idea is it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So every time that we elect to import language directly from, let's say, an OAR or an ORS into our local code, that's good for readability or usability on the part of somebody who might not know specifically to go to those sources to find that information. And so our code can be sort of a one-stop shop, so to speak. The problem is those pieces of language that are relying on the ORS or OAR, we're constantly having to be vigilant in case there are changes. And then we have to go through an entire process, much like the one that you're going through here today, to update that language if changes do occur at the state. By and large, the things that we have chosen to use by reference, where we say has the definition set forth, those are things that also have specific standards that come from state law. So you mentioned property line, for example. The reason property line has a very specific definition in the ORS language is because there's an entire series of ORS language that deals with property line adjustments. And property line adjustments have to go through a very particular process that's largely governed by state law. And in order to align with those same standards, it's very helpful to just use the ORS definition in that particular case. Certain definitions that you might think would appear in state law, like dwelling unit, for example, don't actually, or at least there's not a single definition that appears anywhere that we can rely on. Something like property line or property line adjustment, those things do have very singular definitions.
Or lot or parcel.
Lot or parcel, those also have very specific singular definitions. And so it's easy to simply rely on the state law. Again, one, because we're hopefully not caught in a cycle where we're having to update as changes might occur at the state level. And also we understand, just based on this particular clear and objective standpoint, that the state definitions, whatever they may be, even if there's subjective language in there, there seems to be some safe harbor associated with the state
Yeah.
definitions as well.
Their mandate and it's their language. I get it.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. That answers it, Colin. Fair enough. Thanks for.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
Any other questions?
I guess,
Oh, yes, Commissioner Kelly.
I believe this is maybe the right time to,
Is it deliberation or a question?
maybe question.
Okay.
Yeah, question. Back to the kitchen, Kyle.
Sure.
I'm okay. Thank you. Okay, that really helps me with the description because I was Googling like, why is that word here? This makes no sense. It's an adjective. It's describe. Yeah, like why are we secretive about the kitchen? And so thank you for bringing that up. I just Googled to get it and totally makes sense now why you chose that word. So apologize for
Yeah,
that.
that's just a Scrivener's error.
Okay.
Apologies.
But I'm still okay. Beside that, I'm still a little hung up on why are we using the term outside of a bath? Because I have a sink in my utility room, and I feel like if we say outside of a bath, do we also need to say outside of a utility room? Is that necessary to have in the definition, or why? Help me.
Yeah,
And I apologize. I want to humbly say that like I told you, I feel like I'm a toddler questioning an adult because. So just know it comes from a humble question.
No, it is a great question. And this is a little bit of a puzzle. This is probably, I told Commissioner Kelly earlier, this is probably like the 25th or 30th iteration of this that we've gone through with like minor tweaks to get, I think, what we're ultimately trying to get through. But it boils down to, in some ways, a kitchen. We're trying to determine what the components that exist in every kitchen are likely to be. A sink is one of those. You also have sinks elsewhere in most houses, presumably the most common being in a bathroom. We have specific definitions for baths as well that talk about what is included or is not included in a bath. So once you have a sink that's not included in a bathroom, you triggered basically half of the kitchen definition right there. So it's to sort of set the alarms off. Like if I was reviewing a set of plans as a building inspector or a planner, I would say, okay, there's a sink outside of a bath. What else do I need to be looking for here? The second piece is what actually triggers the remaining portion of the kitchen definition, which is the one or more of the following. And then we list things which are essentially food, heating appliances, cooking appliances, etc., or things that are in association with that. So if you have a sink, for example, in your laundry room, that's fine. That doesn't trigger the kitchen definition in this case, because presumably you also don't have a food heating appliance in your laundry room in that case. So we would move along. It technically is not a bath, but you are allowed to have a sink outside of a bath, provided it also does not contain one of these other things. And again, it's not your sink in your specific primary kitchen that you've designated. The other reason I think discrete came up, just to put this on the record, the reason we dabbled around a lot of different terminology, how to describe discrete, it itself is already a little bit of a slippery word. But one of the concerns that was brought up by our current planning partners and just in our internal discussions is, how do we ensure that, let's say you have a very open planned dwelling unit. So maybe you have sinks all over the place. It starts to become difficult to say, well, is the entire house a kitchen technically under some very broad definition? And discrete was added in essentially to put some brackets around the fact that the kitchen itself is a component of a dwelling. It's not that a dwelling itself is a kitchen in some broader sense. It's a little bit of is a square or rectangle kind of problem, where technically it is true that a dwelling is a kitchen, but we wanted to make sure that it didn't get confusing in an interpretive sense.
Okay. I'll move on because I can just keep going. I kind of in a hamster wheel about the kitchen definition, and I understand that. Should it reference like a kitchen is a place to prepare and store food? Like, I feel like that's lacking in the definition when it seems like that's an obvious part of a kitchen.
That's a great question. And I think one that you also could bring up in deliberations. I will say in a previous iteration, we actually did talk about designed or constructed for the preparation of food. The difficulty when we're talking about a clear and objective definition is when do you say something has been designed for a specific purpose? And so when you start talking about what is the intent behind something, that starts to get away from a clear and objective
Yeah.
definition. Whereas when we're talking about specific physical components, those are things that once multiple components are in this case, a sink outside of a bathroom and one of these things, it's a kitchen. Doesn't matter what you've designed it for.
It's measurable.
And it is a very objective, measurable
Okay.
set of standards.
Yeah, I think what we're here for is we're trying to create boxes. That if you can check all the boxes, you can get an approval.
Yeah.
If you can't check the boxes, then there's another stage.
Okay.
And
That's a good way of summarizing it.
That helps me.
so it's something that theoretically a computer could make give you an approval if you've answered the questions correctly.
Yes or no, yes or no. Kind of. Okay.
So-
Thank you, Kyle.
And I would have one comment with any place you're using the word average is define which of the three averages you're using.
That's
Mean, median, and mode.
Yeah.
So just a thought, because they all have a different way of calculating. So, aside from that, any other questions?
Apology to Kyle, who every other time I address him, I call him Colin. So
no, you're fine.
Oh,
I don't have a question. I would just let Commissioner Kelly know I have seen washers and dryers in kitchens.
Yeah.
So we can get off the wheel.
I'm off the.
all right. With that, we will move on to deliberations. I would have one question for Peter, quick. I know you'd like us to approve these one at a time and move on. I guess my thought would be to do a tentative approval per package. And then do a final approval at the end to where we can basically go back through them one at a time and say, okay, is everybody still good with where we ended up on this package? And move all the way through for a final adoption at the end, in case there's some things that's in segment 4, we decide that, well, gee whiz, we want to go back and look at number 1 again, and we'll wait to address that till we get all done. Does that make sense, or is that something that messes up your schedule?
Make sure I'm, Mr. Chairman, that I'm understanding what you're conceptualizing is there's going to be several components of the clear and objective amendments. This is component number 1. You would be, you're contemplating to the extent that there's, after deliberation, there's support for the amendment, there's an acknowledgement that there, and Kyle can communicate, Alan Will can communicate this to the Board of County Commissioners, that as the Planning Commission fully digests the totality of the clear and objective standards, there could be, at the later stages, a necessity to revisit a section, further clarifying an issue that warrants it, and thereby through each adoption stage, or even all the way to the very end, there could be some additional housekeeping amendments that are folded in at the board's stage. That's at least that's how I would respectfully, if that made any sense, suggest the Planning Commission handle the totality of the package, because the Planning Commission doesn't operate in kind of like we're tentatively approving this subject to further examination of the other elements of the forthcoming clear and objective standards. I mean, you could do that. I think we're going to find ourselves in kind of some procedural ambiguity that, and this process is hard enough, but I think the intent that you're wanting to communicate to staff respectfully, and this has been really helpful. All of your questions or comments are helping to ground this package ultimately when it gets to the board, because the board that doesn't have your attention span because they're focused on a myriad of issues. My thought is letting the board know if the consensus is the planning commission that you may be bringing up elements of earlier amendments to the clear and objective standards, and you want the board to be aware that there could be a recommendation in package 2, package 3, package 4 that is revisiting what they approved maybe a month or two ago in package 1. And that provides throughput, I think, for staff and the board to go, oh, under this hypothetical, staff is bringing back, in addition to package number 4, the planning commission, upon additional reflection and context, wants to bring back an amendment, which I think we can do under the spirit of the totality of the package of code amendments, is bringing back these elements from the first set of amendments. So that's how I would characterize it. But Kyle, do I feel like that's in alignment with what your thoughts are?
It is. I think I would point out two different things, maybe to add on top of that, which is, I think as we're working through these next stages, these next packages of amendments that are going to come up, it is quite likely that either we as staff or members of the public, potentially the Board of County Commissioners, are going to recognize, oh, maybe we need to think further about things that we've already had discussions for. And in the spirit of, like we've said, these are kinds of works in progress, really up to the point basically that we say, here's the full package board. Do you want to sign these or not? Under that kind of framework, I think we're going to be sort of tinkering with these almost the entire time. The goal really with this first package, as we pointed out during the hearing and during your work session, is these are kind of the foundational concepts, and we really need to have something just to work off of to move towards some of these community conversations in the next stages that are probably going to be much more focused and much more controversial, honestly. And so the point is not that these can never come up again. So for example, if we start talking about our Goal 5 resources, maybe you want to say, well, how does that function with these new definitions that we've included? And that can always be something that either we bring up directly as, hey, maybe you want to talk about this, or maybe you think of it of your own accord and you want to bring it up with your fellow commissioners and talk it further.
Okay. And I guess that's kind of where I was getting at is this going to be presented to the Board of Commissioners as a single package or in segments?
It will be in segments in much the same way that you will be receiving it. But I would say future packages can also revisit previous packages to a certain extent.
Okay. And I guess that would be my request is that we be able to circle back if, like I say, we get into, the fifth package and decide what, as you described, maybe we've got some amendments that we want to readdress definitions going, well, that really doesn't make sense in this context.
And we know I've pointed out in some very specific instances, just to provide something to kind of ground this. We've kind of pulled over what, let's say, our grade definition is. We have some specific language for grade, how it's dealt with in the landscape management combining zone. We already know that that's going to have to be changed as a part of these broader Goal 5 discussions moving forward. And so we've kind of already flagged and noted some of these areas that we know are going to change as a part of this process, kind of this iterative process. But there's almost certainly likely to be other ones that are going to come up that we don't anticipate. And that is open.
Right. Thank you. So I guess the next question for the commissioners is, how would you like to proceed? Does somebody have a motion you'd like to make to move forward, or do we want to kind of go through it page by page and see if anybody's got any comments as we go?
I have a motion.
Commissioner
Oh, sorry.
Williams.
I was merely going to say that I feel comfortable approving everything as is to the board, knowing that we will probably have to come back and visit some of the definitions, but I feel comfortable with all 742 pages as of right now.
Okay.
So that's just my input.
Commissioner Kieras.
I move to forward recommendation to approve the amendments to the Board of County Commissioners.
Is there a second?
I would second.
It's been moved and seconded to move forward with the recommendations as edited, I guess, the most recent version. Is there any discussion? The maker?
Yeah, similar to what Commissioner Williams said, I feel comfortable with the way it is. We aren't being asked to make substantive changes to the county code. There was a whole comprehensive plan update process that we just spent a lot of time on that was about discussing substantive things that have to do with the county's vision moving forward. And my understanding is that this is a completely separate process where we're being asked to make the code clear and objective, as Commissioner Cyrus described before, set of checkboxes, like, do you meet these or not? I don't, I do not want or have any interest in getting into any debates or discussions or deliberations about substantive things that as a part of this discussion, substantive meaning substantive beyond our very interesting wordsmithing conversations that we've been having. That said, I would be really interested if people, I know people already gave comments and opinions during the question section, sort of relative to some of these amendments. But if people have additional comments they want to share, I think that should be part of our discussion. But I'm more comfortable proceeding with deliberations when there's a motion on the table because it makes me feel like I know what we're actually discussing. So that's why I decided to try to make a motion at the outset of the conversation.
Great, thank you. Is there any other discussion? Commissioner Hofkamp?
I'm in agreement with the comments. I personally feel ready to close deliberations tonight if my colleagues agree. And I'm in agreement with the motion and intend to support it to recommend the amendments to the board on clear and objective standards. The one thing that I'm curious about, I bet my colleagues up here share that, is when we get packets down the road, some of the code, I think by its nature, even attempting to make it clear and objective, is going to grade into substantive changes. So I'm curious how that's going to play out. And I don't think that was so much the case here. There were some exceptions maybe, but for the most part, I agree with you that the comprehensive plan involved a lot more substantive issues. And this is more of a, conforming to what's perceived as clear and objective. But we'll see what happens with packets down the road. But, yeah, I intend to
Great,
support
thank you. Anybody else?
I plan to support the motion.
Okay,
Good.
all those in favor, please say by saying aye.
I
When I vote aye, any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Oh, and we don't have anything else on the agenda. So I would open it up to staff and planning commission comments. Who would like to go first? Like Peter's queuing up.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and planning commissioners. Just some housekeeping going forward. Will and I want to be really mindful of your time and make sure, while this has the potential to be a relatively short meeting, the deliberations that and the recommendation that you just offered is incredibly helpful to staff. As Kyle noted, going forward for kind of as we get into kind of late winter and in the spring, we really want to manage your time. There's a lot headed your way, specifically around clear and objective standards. So having said that, Will can get into the kind of his schedule as it pertains to clear and objective standards tentatively, but we don't have anything substantively for your first meeting in February. So we just want to honor your time. So that's on February 13th. What is on your horizon, though, that from a department head standpoint is in March, you will likely get debriefed on a work session for the next fiscal year's Community Development Department Planning Division work plan. So that's coming with a forthcoming hearing. And then I took the liberty in collaboration with Will and others to establish for the first time an annual report that discusses the Community Development Department's commitment in Southern Deschutes County for groundwater protection. And similar to the rural housing profile that you receive, which is where we think there's a lot of benefit to just provide that information objectively. The same is true for this annual groundwater protection program. Obviously, the Newberry Country Plan is going to get updated. Obviously, the South County groundwater is going to be a topic. And so that's something I want to bring back to you, likely on your will be your only meeting in February, which is on the 27th. I'm shooting to update the Board of County Commissioners at their work session on February 3rd. And so I want to get them, the first bite at that apple. But at the same time, I'm looking at Commissioner Williams, who represents Southern Deschutes County. This is something I think is really important. Some of our newer planning commissioners, Commissioner Kelly and Commissioner Stockamp. There's a lot to be familiar with and maybe understand some of the history. As I look at Chair Cyrus, when his father was on the Planning Commission, we were talking about Southern Deschutes groundwater and various elements to it. So that's just another topic that I think will warrant a good conversation, and in addition to several other items that Will can summarize. But again, just Will and I want to be mindful of your time, and we want to have robust agendas for you, and at the same time, not have you feel like you're coming all this way for a singular item and then you're heading back home. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but by all means, this is going to be a very busy year. So I don't want you to think that taking a meeting off in February foretells a light agenda for the year. So those are my comments, and I turn it over to you, Will, for additional remarks.
Peter, can I ask you, sorry to interrupt. Can I ask you, Peter, why I'm sure there's a reason why it focuses on Southern Deschutes County, water issues in Southern Deschutes County. And I know that there's a unique hydrology there and a really high water table and so forth. Going to the trouble of a report like that, why not a countywide report on water?
It's a really good question, Commissioner Hovkamp. And it's not to say that there aren't areas in different regions of our county that have groundwater challenges. This is really recognizing the relatively unique lotting pattern south of Sun River, outside of the incorporated area of Lapine, where thousands of lots were platted before the statewide land use system, before the county had any really land division codes. And there's a lot of work, some significant investigations by the Department of Environmental Quality and the U.S. Geological Survey, really hone in on the Lapine subbasin. So it is distinct. The nitrate challenges that exist there are prominent in ways that they're not in others. That's not to say that you can't, in small isolated areas, you can't have challenges, but this is an area that's approximately 125 square miles that just has unique geology, a unique lotting pattern, and decades of efforts that demonstrate a commitment to groundwater protection, and yet it's still vulnerable. And it's important, I think, for the Community Development Department, really Deschutes County, in collaboration with the Department of Environmental Quality and other entities, to to share our experience factually. And this is something I just think that will build over time to communicate what's been happening, some success stories, some opportunities, some groundwater monitoring efforts as those occur over time, so that to the greatest degree possible, government doesn't do a great job of sharing these investments I'm characterizing as investments in an area. And I think while this report won't solve all of those challenges, I think it demonstrates a sincere commitment to educate our county commissioners, get them refamiliarized with what we've done and what we can do in the future. You'll see in this report, there's short and long-term strategies. I welcome your input and feedback, as I do from the board and others, but I'm getting long-winded, but it's really focused in that sub area. So thanks. Great question.
Right, Will?
And just to maybe to look at the headline there, the anticipation from the models that are down there is that some people maybe many people in that area will have water that doesn't meet state or federal drinking water requirements. There's nowhere else in the county where there's good science that suggests that people will not be able or would not be advisable for them to drink their well water. And I think that there's going to be a moment of reckoning, 10, 20, 30 years from now as that happens. Hey, government, where were you? And the answer was working this the entire time. When you see this report and you see the decades of effort that's been put into a variety of programs that have lessened what will, ultimately be the number of people and the total kind of contamination associated with those wells, I think it's going to be impressive. But there will be people who one day will get a letter from the state that says, we don't recommend you drink your water. And they'll come back to us and be, what did you do to help? And the answer is going to be 100 pages long by then.
Great. Thank you. Anything else?
No, I just very briefly, I went at some length kind of at our last meeting about all the things that are coming up, housekeeping, Clear and Objective. And I do want to note that we're going to have a bit of a plug of Clear and Objective. If everything goes well, we're going to have a plug of Clear and Objective modules, including the Goal 5 inventory work, the subdivision work, as well as a second module through Title 18 that all should be passing through the Planning Commission about the same time. So we're going to do our best to stagger those. I know we all start having sort of flagging attention after about 3 hours. So I'm going to try to route those in the best way possible. And also we've got a hard deadline of July 30th, where rules that aren't fixed basically are not applicable. So we're sprinting at that with our consultant. We had a great meeting with our consultant today, who's getting really close to being ready to return to us the Title 17 and Goal 5 Clear and Objective. And to Commissioner Hovkamp's point, the Goal 5, I think in particular, is going to be difficult. That's really something that, I'm thinking metaphorically of sort of, we asked experts, people with decades of experience and looking at on the ground conditions, how something is going to turn out. And now we're trying to replace that with a paint by numbers exercise it's going to be tough. And I think people will have vigorous opinions about how, what the balance is between the rigor of protecting the resource versus the complexity of the regulations. I think that's going to be there's going to be some substantive discussion throughout both the Planning Commission and the board with that. If you made a copy of me, we would argue with ourselves for the next hour about how we're approaching that. So it's a tricky one to approach. So just keeping you appraised of that, although we don't have anything coming up at the next meeting, there will be some longer meetings as we come in. And I see those as kind of somewhere about 60 days out is probably when 2 months is when we're starting to see those start to flow through the system.
Great. Thanks. Commissioner, anybody else? You're welcome to, or you can pass if you don't want to.
Just for fun. Just wanted to give a quick update on our medical hardship text amendment. So we've been working on that to align our medical hardship code more closely with state law. It's pretty much a housekeeping amendment, but there's a couple policy choices in there. We've been working with our internal divisions this week to kind of clean up our first draft, but I think we're hoping to come to the Planning Commission with that within the next month or two. So that'll be on your plate as well, and it should be pretty interesting. So thanks.
Great. Thank you. Kyle, did you have more? Perfect. Commissioner Hovkamp.
Thanks.
Commissioner Kelly.
Thank you, Kyle, for all your work on this. I do not envy, and all of y'all, but I don't envy.
Commissioner Stockamp.
Yeah, thanks for everything tonight. I just have one question. I think it'd be Nicole, Peter, or Will. What's status on the comp plan then? Because I know it was appealed. Is it moving through up to, I assume, Luba, or where's that heading now?
Sorry, just shocked myself with these microphones. So essentially the latest that we heard is that this was probably a month ago now. We were settling the record at Luba, and there was a request from Central Oregon Land Watch to include some materials that weren't in the record. We were willing to provide those materials, but our legal counsel essentially just decided to move forward and kind of move forward on our record submittal. So Luba will be kind of deciding what needs to be in the record or out of the record. We understand that that can sometimes take some time. So we're in that waiting phase, just waiting to hear back from Luba on the actual settlement of the record. Once that's settled, we should get the petitioner's brief, which will be helpful since I think I mentioned at the last meeting, we haven't really heard from Landwatch what their core issues are with the comprehensive plan. So we'll be waiting on that to kind of determine next steps. But in the meantime, we'll keep you updated on what we hear on that front.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
Vice Chair.
Thanks for being chair.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Commissioner Williams,
All good.
Mr. Kieras.
Yep, great, concise meeting and happy to be here.
Thanks. And I actually had a couple things just for all the commissioners. As they mentioned, in March, we're going to be addressing our work plan for the year. So if you've got any issues or thoughts or things that you'd like to add to that work plan, now would be the time to at least think about them. I've got a few things that in the past 2 years, there's been a lot of discussion kind of following up with what Peter had mentioned, water in South County, and Commissioner Hovkamp, water in general is a recurring topic on almost every hearing we have on every topic. I personally would like to see a panel discussion if we could put something together. If we've got some empty slots somewhere between now and the end of the year, rather than skip a meeting, maybe we can fill in with some things like, I'd love to see a panel on water, a panel on mule deer, follow up on a little more discussion with some experts on that topic. And it's been since probably the 90s, even since, for example, destination resorts have been discussed. I think that would make an interesting panel. The other one is the perennial discussion that I've heard since I've been on the commission is dark skies, and I'm not sure where it may be on the agenda. It'd be nice to elevate it to a work plan, but kind of you guys give some thought to what you might want to do this year, and we can coordinate with these guys to see what might fit in our schedules. So with that, we'll close the meeting.
Thank you.
Well, has our gavel officially gone missing? Because it was not here last time either.
So who took it home?